Hey everybody, this is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous good-looking friends. So I have been sitting on the fence about talking about this headline that came out on November 1st, in which King Charles will deliver the COP28 opening speech. Now, for those that don't know, COP stands for Conference of Parties, in which it is an annual convention held by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as the UNFCCC. Folks, I don't know how to break this to you, but the king is full speed ahead on board with what the UN is doing, what the WHO is doing, as well as what the WEF are doing, because he is a part of it. I'd like to know, how are we allowing this to go on when none of these entities are government elected bodies and are making decisions for the rest of the world? How is this even happening? I listened to Lady C's most recent broadcast, and I agree with her. This is a serious matter. Right now, we have the UN dictating all kinds of things, from clamping down and getting a framework and a unified global structure together to manage AI. We have another situation going on with the WHO, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And then we have all this other stuff that's going on in the background around climate change and what we need to do as humans in order to achieve this sustainable existence, in which these folks that are dictating all of this, they're not even doing it themselves. So why are they being allowed to control this? And I'm going to bring Charles into this because he has been a part of this. In order for us to understand how we got here, we have to go back to understand the history. So let's start with the World Commission on Environment and Development report from 1987. So essentially, this division of the UN was tasked to set out a global agenda for change, which included addressing the challenges at that time, which included poverty, population increase, equality gap. I mean, all the things that we're talking about today in relation to the environment and how we need to change certain things, whether it be from the choices that they make in energy, the industries producing more with less, and blah, blah, blah. Everything that we are listening to today, they were talking about the same thing back in 1987. Now, fast forward in a keynote address delivered on April 22nd, 1992, to this World Commission on Environment and Development, the Prince of Wales discussed global environmental problems. Of that included special emphasis on rapid population growth as a factor aggravating environmental problems and seeking to influence the deliberations of the UN conference, urging the adoption of these policies, which would address the environment, poverty, and population growth together, with the emphasis of doing it together rather than in isolation. Now, I want you to hear this for yourself so you can come to your own conclusion around what we're seeing happening today in the world.
The issues raised are never going to be comfortable subjects for polite conversation. Apart from anything else, they always make you sound so intolerably gloomy. And I'd much rather make people feel happy. But I think we have to ask ourselves, firstly, whether we can continue to ignore the prospect of a virtual doubling of the world's population to somewhere approaching 10 billion by the year 2050. Secondly, can we look forward to any kind of real security as the global gap between rich and poor continues to widen? If we compare the per capita wealth of Europe with China or India, the ratio in 1890 was 2 to 1. By 1940, that ratio was 40 to 1. Today, it is 70 to 1. With these statistics in mind, is it really any wonder that the South are approaching the Rio Conference event with open economic demands? For them, it is essentially a conference about development and justice. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not want to add to the controversy over cause and effect with respect to the Third World's problems. Suffice it to say that I don't, in all logic, see how any society can hope to improve its lot when population growth regularly exceeds economic growth. The factors which will reduce population growth are by now easily identified. A standard of healthcare that makes family planning viable, increased female literacy, reduced infant mortality, and access to clean water. Achieving them, of course, is more difficult, but perhaps two simple truths need to be writ large over the portals of every international gathering about the environment. We will not slow the birth rate much until we find ways of addressing poverty, and we will not protect the environment until we address the issues of population growth and poverty in the same breath. I do wish that these simple and incontestable truths could find greater prominence on the Rio agenda. Sadly, it seems that certain delegations are determined to prevent discussion of population growth. In so doing, of course, they deny everyone else the opportunity for constructive discussion of policies which would address the environment, poverty and population growth together rather than in isolation. I can well understand why your report called for huge increases in the rates of economic growth in the Third World, but the rigour that informed your analysis of just how unsustainable the world economy is today seemed, if I may say so, rather to desert you in your prescriptions for finding an appropriate way out of this all-encompassing dilemma. Is it really wise to call for such rapid growth until we can be certain that the growth which emerges will both serve the people most in need and, in your much used and much abused words, not compromise the rights of future generations to meet their own needs? It is now widely accepted by economists that gross national product is merely a reasonably good indicator of the overall level of a nation's economic activity. It is a thoroughly misleading indicator of national well-being, let alone sustainability. We clearly need some measure of green GNP, which calculates the nation's output after deducting the depreciation on nature's capital. No business can afford to operate by eating into its capital, and in this respect, nations are no different. It's encouraging that several countries are now proposing green GNP measures or some other alternative indicators, but much more effort is needed in evaluating and promoting such concepts, and I do most profoundly hope that this will feature large in your report to the Rio conference. All the evidence from the environmental disasters of previous generations shows that the problems were often identified at a relatively early stage, but that nothing was actually done until the economic interests of a nation state were adversely affected in a visible and incontrovertible way. Quite simply, to trigger earlier action, we need to show politicians that the environment matters not just for itself, but in economic terms. We can show the effects of soil erosion by looking at the value of the lost crops resulting from the erosion. We can look at the costs of preventing floods from sea level rise. We can look at air pollution damage to buildings, crops, and forests.
So the concepts that Charles had laid out in this keynote speech had set and laid the groundwork for what is being called the Agenda 21, which is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations systems, governments, and major groups in every area in which human impacts on the environment. His influence on the sustainable development, particularly around the environment, has led us to where we are today. Hopefully by now, most of you have seen this colorful UN graphic that is being pushed everywhere inside corporations, as well as on the UN website, talking about ending poverty and world hunger and bridging the inequality gap, as well as, let's not forget, in parallel of that, saving the planet. So reduction of carbon emissions, sustainable cities and communities, the things that we're hearing now, such as getting rid of fossil fuels and moving to electricity when nothing is working, especially putting those windmills in the middle of the ocean, which it was recently exposed that it had been killing marine life, such as many whales were showing up dying on the shore. Keep in mind, these sustainable development goals have been in play now for the last couple of decades. When we look at no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, and so on, None of these goals seem to have gotten any better. In fact, a lot of them have gotten worse. And let's take a look at world hunger. Let's take a look at poverty in the United States. According to Statistica, it looks like we're going right back up to where we were during the Obama years. So, are these sustainable development goals working out for our country? No, not for poverty and solving it. Or how about the amount of people who are going hungry in the UK, in which the number of people receiving emergency food parcels from Trussell Trust food banks in the UK from years 2008 to 2023 has skyrocketed? Am I reading this number correctly? That almost 3 million people in the UK are going to food banks because they don't have food? How is it that we're living in first world countries and we have people going hungry, people living in poverty? Can you imagine if this is happening in first world countries, what's really happening in third world countries, exacerbated by these stupid sustainable goals that are being set out onto the people of the world? Let's go back to this chart for a second. How are they going to have economic growth and reduced inequalities when we have streamlined processes and elimination of jobs by using AI and technology, as well as the majority of the wealth is concentrated by a small group of people? How are they going to bridge that inequality gap when the wealth and job opportunities have been limited? Explain this to me. In all honesty, when you stop and just take a look at what's going on around you, not being distracted by the Harry and Megans and the bullshit that they keep putting out in our faces to distract us, it's really this agenda that is being carried out in order, and in my opinion, as you know, reading from the beginning as to where this UN came from and who is behind it, who's backing it, it does appear to me that there is a concerted effort towards figuring out how to reduce the population. And I know many of you don't want to hear that and think it's conspiracy. I'm speculating. I don't know, but it sure looks like it. I mean, we have one catastrophe after another catastrophe, and what you're seeing are these people exploiting it, making money off of it, getting richer, people getting poorer, people dying, people not living quality lives, people having to give up certain freedoms because it's not in line with what is being forced upon us, which now takes me into this whole pandemic treaty that Lady C had been talking about. 194 countries are in bed with the UN without giving the people the say on whether or not our money should be going to fund this thing. First, let's start off with this Dr. Tedros. I can't even pronounce the rest of his name, but he is the director general of this health organization that is trying to push this pandemic treaty on us. Do you guys know that this guy is not even a doctor, like a real doctor? His doctor is for academics. The guy earned his PhD in philosophy. Imagine that the head of this health organization is not really a doctor in medicine, but a doctor in philosophy. Now let's take a quick moment and talk a little bit about Dr. Tedros. So, back in June of 2020, Bloomberg released an article in which U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo told a group of British lawmakers that China had bought the head of this World Health shit show. Pompeo said that there was firm intelligence to show that a deal had been done to get Dr. Tedros this World Health Director General position. And now I'm not going to talk further about this. You guys can go ahead and do some research and read all about the shadiness around this guy. But I would like to mention that when this was going on in the very beginning, I watched this guy in January get on video, talk about what's happening, how many people were infected, where they were infected, and then explaining to everyone that there was like this 2-week incubation phase, that if you came in contact with someone, then, you don't know it until like 2 weeks later when symptoms show up. And what I didn't understand is every day that this World Health was reporting on and giving updates to the world, the cases were growing exponentially. Like at the point of when they finally called it this pandemic, it was March 11th, and there were over 118,000 cases around the world in over 110 countries. Why did they wait so long? And part of me says, well, was that intentional? This man sat on television and looked everybody in the face as he was saying how this was getting worse and worse, but still didn't call it until it reached that point. I remember this was one of the things that really bugged me about how all of this went down. In the very beginning, I kept scratching my head saying, how many cases he's telling the world have been identified. Why is this not being called a pandemic and take measures to stop the spread, especially since we all knew that the incubation period was like 2 weeks and you wouldn't even know if you had the virus in your system. At that point, even in February, there were so many cases that, like, at what point was the threshold? And in my opinion, I believe that this guy sat on it fully knowing what this was and took no action because of somebody else telling him what to do. And I'll leave you to that conclusion yourself. But when you look back and now you see what they're trying to propose in a power grab, this is essentially what it is. It kind of makes you wonder, was that intentional? Was not declaring this earlier intentional? In my opinion, I believe so. And quite frankly, I don't trust this guy as far as I see him. And when this guy is aligning with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, as they did back when they were trying to push these COVID jabs, I'm sorry, I don't trust him. Anything that touches Meghan and Harry, is dirty. I think that this is a good place to stop. I am going to do a part 2 to this series, talking about the dangers of this treaty and why we need to push back and say no. Lady C is 100% right about the dangers of what this treaty means if it gets passed through in the speedy manner that they're trying to get it through by May of 2024. My suggestion is listen to her and write your MPs. And at the same time, in the United States, we all need to be screaming and hollering and writing to our congressmen, telling them to wake up and defund this organization. This is not an elected body that should be making decisions on behalf of the American people. This is a really serious thing, and it does infuriate me to see the king supporting the UN in such a way, especially going to speak at this COP28. I get that he's an environmentalist, but all these sustainable goals that they have in front of everyone enforcing down our throats is not helping the rest of us. And to me, that just shows that there's something else that's going on here. If it is indeed about population reduction, then shame on all these leaders that are pushing for all of this, because that means they don't believe and value human life as equal to theirs. It does trouble me that King Charles is the head of the Anglican Church and not promoting Christian values. It also does bother me that he is a part of the WEF and the UN and supporting their initiatives around this sustainable development. This whole thing, in my opinion, is such a sham. Anyhow, I think that this is a good place to pause. I'm going to leave you with this 2-minute video of Dr. Tedros, who is the doctor of philosophy, not actual medicine, telling you why we need this pandemic treaty and what it means. You leave your thoughts and let me know. And as always, I will be back with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Dear colleagues and friends, as you know, there have been several reviews of the global response to the pandemic with many recommendations for strengthening global health security. They all recognize the need for better systems and tools, better financing, including for global public goods such as vaccines, better global governance, and a stronger, empowered, and sustainably financed WHO. To connect and underpin these ideas, I believe the time is right for an international treaty or other legally binding instrument to provide the framework for a more coherent and coordinated response to future epidemics and pandemics. Whatever new structures or mechanisms are established, they must promote equity and galvanize the engagement and ownership of all countries. They must be multi-sectoral, involving partners from across the One Health spectrum. They must be coherent with the international health regulations. They must be rooted in the constitutional mandate of WHO. And they must be accountable and transparent. Thank you for your engagement in discussing and analyzing the legal tools available for pandemic preparedness as we prepare for the special session of the World Health Assembly in November. The pandemic has taught us many lessons. The most important is that we're one species sharing one planet, and we have no future but a shared future. I thank you.
It was such a fraud.